One old man sits on a black volcanic rock in the middle of the Aegean Sea. He is the last of his kind. Every other man who walked with Jesus is dead. Some were crucified. Some were beheaded. Some were stoned in city squares by crowds who thought they were doing God a favor. And this man, the youngest of them, the one who ran fastest to the empty tomb, has survived all of it, only to end up here. Exiled. Alone. Waiting. He is waiting for a promise. And we will get to him. But not yet. Because before we can understand what that old man is waiting for on that black rock, we need to go back. Way back. 4,000 years back, to a moment when God spoke a sentence to one man, and set in motion the longest chain of kept promises in human history. This is not a video about theology. This is not a lecture about doctrine. This is a video about a pattern. And the pattern is this. God makes a promise. Time passes. The promise looks forgotten, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries. And then, without warning, in a moment nobody saw coming, the promise arrives. Every single time. You are standing inside this pattern right now, whether you know it or not. The man in Apos' name is Abram. He is 75 years old, and he has no children. In the ancient Near East, that is not just a personal disappointment. It is a death sentence on your legacy. Everything you built, everything you farmed, everything you named, gone when you die. No heir, no continuation, just silence after your last breath. His wife Sarai is 65. She has been barren her entire life. The word the Hebrew text uses is akara, a word that carries not just the biological fact but the social weight. In that world, a barren woman carried shame she did not earn and could not escape. Into this situation, no heir, no hope, no reason for optimism, God speaks. Leave your country. Leave your people. Leave your father and Apos' household. Go to a land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. That is it. No map. No timeline. No explanation. Just a direction and a promise. And Abram goes. Here in Apos. That's what most people miss about the next 25 years. The Bible does not skip them. It makes you feel them. You watch Abram wait through 1 year. Then 5. Then 10. He is 85 now, and Sarai is 75, and the promise still has not moved. So they try to help God along. Hagar, Ishmael, the whole painful detour that still echoes across the Middle East today. And God says, that is not the child I meant. 15 more years pass. Abram is 99 years old when God changes his name to Abraham, father of many nations, before a single nation exists. Before a single child is born. God names him for something that has not happened yet, as if the promise is already so certain it can be treated as fact. And then Isaac is born. The Hebrew word is yitzhak, he laughs. Because when the angels told Abraham his 90-year-old wife would have a child, Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And when Sarah heard, she laughed too, from inside the tent, and then denied it because she was afraid. And God said, no, you laughed. And when the boy arrived, this impossible, ridiculous, world-altering boy, they named him Laughter. 25 years. That is how long the gap was. And then God asked for him back. You know the story. The mountain. The wood. The knife. The boy who trusts his father enough to walk up that hill without running. And at the last possible second, a voice from heaven, and a ram in the thicket, and a father who collapses with relief so profound the Bible does not even try to describe it. What God was doing on that mountain is a conversation for another video. But what you need to see right now is this. The promise survived. 25 years of waiting. A detour through Hagar. A near sacrifice on a mountain. And the thread held. 4,000 years later, 3 world religions trace their lineage, spiritual or biological, to that old man who packed his bags at 75 and walked toward a land he had never seen, because a voice told him to go. The pattern had begun. The boy in Apos' name is Joseph, and he is 17 years old, and he has just had 2 dreams that will ruin the next 13 years of his life. In the first dream, his brothers and Apos' sheaves of grain bowed down to his sheaf. In the second, the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. He tells his brothers, this is, by any measure, a significant social error. His brothers already resent him. The favorite son, the one with the coat, the one their father loves with an obviousness that humiliates them every day. And now this 17-year-old is telling them that one day they will bow before him. They decide to kill him. Then they decide to sell him instead, which is worse in its own way, because death is at least final. What they sell him into is something that grinds slowly. An Egyptian slave caravan. A household in Potiphar and Apos' service. Then a false accusation. Then prison. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century in his Antiquities of the Jews, describes the prison system of ancient Egypt as subterranean, lightless, designed not for rehabilitation but for disappearance. Men entered and the world forgot them. Joseph enters. And the dreams, those two impossible, reckless, 17-year-old dreams, go silent. 2 years pass in the prison after Joseph correctly interprets the cupbearer and Apos' dream, and the cupbearer is restored to Pharaoh and Apos' court exactly as Joseph predicted. 2 years in which the cupbearer forgets to mention him. 2 years in which Joseph wakes up every morning in a cell that is exactly as dark as the morning before. But it gets stranger, because the moment of fulfillment, when it comes, takes less than 24 hours. One night Pharaoh cannot sleep. He has a dream. Nobody can interpret it. And a cupbearer, suddenly, after 2 years, remembers a Hebrew boy in a prison who was very good with dreams. Joseph is brought up from the pit. He interprets the dream. Pharaoh looks at him and says something extraordinary. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And Joseph, the boy they threw in a cistern, the slave they sold for 20 pieces of silver, the prisoner the world forgot, becomes second in command of the most powerful empire on earth. Then the famine comes. Then his brothers come, bowing before the Egyptian official who controls the grain supply. The official is their brother. They do not recognize him, but he recognizes them. And the Bible says he turned away from them and wept. Not in anger, in awe, in the sudden, overwhelming recognition that the dreams were real, that the 13 years were not a mistake, that every cistern and slave market and prison cell was part of a route that a 17-year-old boy could never have mapped for himself. Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." 13 years. That was the gap. The pattern was holding. Before Moses, there is silence. Not a pause. Not a season. 400 years of silence. 400 years in which the descendants of Abraham multiply into a people, and that people are enslaved, brick by brick, generation by generation, under the whips of a nation that does not know Joseph and Apos' name anymore. The promise God made to Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, I will bring you to a land," has not been forgotten. But it has not moved. And there is no burning bush, no angel, no word from heaven, just the sound of mud being packed into molds, just the sound of taskmasters, just the sound of children born into chains. You have to hold 400 years in your mind. Most people cannot. We think in decades. A century feels ancient to us. 400 years is the distance from the founding of the first permanent English settlement in America to right now. Jamestown to this moment. That is how long the silence lasted. And then a bush lights up and does not burn. Moses is 80 years old, another old man, another impossible starting point, when God speaks from the fire. And what God says is so specific it should make you read it twice. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out. I am concerned about their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them." The Hebrew word for rescue in this passage is yatzah. It does not simply mean to leave. It means to burst out, to break free with force, like water through a cracked dam, like a prisoner through a broken wall. God is not describing an orderly exit. God is describing an eruption. And this is where it gets remarkable. Pharaoh says no, and the plagues begin. And Pharaoh still says no. 10 times, the most powerful man in the world looks at the God of a nation of slaves and says, no. 10 times, the signs escalate. And it is not until the final night, the night of the Passover, the night of the firstborn, that the word finally changes. And then 2 million people walk out. Not in secret, not in hiding. Out through the front, in the middle of the day, after 430 years in Egypt. The descendants of Abraham walk out of the only home they have ever known, carrying silver and gold the Egyptians pressed into their hands just to make them leave, toward a land their great-great-great-grandparents had been promised and never seen. For 100 years. That was the gap. The pattern was still holding. The woman in Apos' name is Ruth, and she should not be in this story at all. She is a Moabite, which, in the social geography of ancient Israel, means she is an outsider in the most complete sense. The Moabites and the Israelites had a history that was long, complicated, and mostly hostile. And Ruth and Apos' situation is even more precarious than her ethnicity. She is a widow, following her widowed mother-in-law Naomi back to a land she has never lived in, to a people who are not her people, because she will not leave an old woman alone. Naomi tells her to go back. Ruth says no. Naomi tells her there is no future for her in Bethlehem. Ruth says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die." It is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the entire Bible, and it comes from a woman who was not supposed to be part of the story. Stay with me. Naomi arrives in Bethlehem and says something devastating. She says, "Do not call me Naomi, pleasant, call me Mara, bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full and came back empty." Empty. She uses the word herself. And into that emptiness walks a man named Boaz. He notices the Moabite woman in his fields. He tells his workers to leave extra grain for her deliberately, to let her drink from their water, to not rebuke her. And when Ruth asks why he is being so kind to a foreigner, Boaz says, "I have heard what you did for Naomi. I have heard that you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to a people you did not know." The Hebrew word that defines Boaz in this story is goel, kinsman redeemer, a man with both the right and the responsibility to restore what was lost to a family member. Boaz becomes Ruth and Apos' redeemer. He marries her, and she bears a son. That son has a son, and that son is named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David. The early church historian Eusebius, writing in the 3rd century, noted the theological significance of Ruth and Apos' place in the messianic line, that a Gentile woman, an outsider, a widow from a hostile nation, was woven into the ancestry of both David and Jesus. Not as a footnote, as a central thread. Naomi said she came back empty. She did not know she came back carrying everything. The promise God makes to David is the boldest one yet. David has just moved the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. He is sitting in his palace, newly established as king, and it bothers him that he lives in a house of cedar while the Ark sits in a tent. He tells the prophet Nathan he wants to build God a house. And God turns the conversation around in a single sentence. "You will not build me a house, David. I will build you one." And then God says the word that will echo through 600 years of apparent ruin. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Forever. It is the kind of promise that sounds magnificent when a king is at the height of his power. It sounds very different from Babylon, because that is where the story goes. David dies. Solomon builds the temple, magnificent, covered in gold, the wonder of the ancient world. Then the kingdom splits. The northern half falls to Assyria in 722 BC. The southern half holds for another century, and then Nebuchadnezzar arrives, and the walls come down, and the temple is gone. And the people are marched to Babylon in chains. Forever looked very broken from Babylon. Here in Apos, the part nobody tells you. The exile does not end the promise. It extends it. Because the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, do not stop speaking about the throne of David. They keep insisting, from inside the wreckage, that the word forever was not hyperbole. 600 years pass. Then an angel visits a girl in a hill town called Nazareth. And the angel says, and you need to hear this the way the people of Babylon would have heard it, as the people who memorized those promises in the dark would have heard it. The angel says, "The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end." The word forever had not expired. 600 years. That was the gap. The pattern had never broken once. 700 years before it happened, a man sat down and wrote a description of it. His name was Isaiah. He was a prophet in Jerusalem during the reign of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and he wrote during one of the most turbulent periods in Israel and Apos' history, when the Assyrian Empire was expanding and the northern kingdom was already gone. He had real, immediate, political problems to address. And yet, in the middle of his book, he wrote 53 lines that describe something that would not happen for 7 centuries. He describes a man despised and rejected, a man familiar with suffering, a man led like a lamb to slaughter, who did not open his mouth. He describes the piercing. The Hebrew is chalal, which does not mean a surface wound. It means a mortal wound, a wound that goes through. He describes one assigned a grave with the wicked who ends up in a rich man and Apos' tomb. He describes the casting of lots, the silence of the accused before those who condemn him. He wrote all of this 700 years before a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate washed his hands in public to avoid responsibility for a verdict he had already given. Pay attention to this. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd in the hills above the Dead Sea threw a stone into a cave and heard something break. What broke was a clay jar. Inside the jar was a scroll. Inside the scroll was the complete book of Isaiah, including chapter 53. Carbon dating and paleographic analysis placed the scroll and Apos' composition at no later than 100 BC. The scroll had been sitting in that cave, sealed, for over 2,000 years. There is no argument about when Isaiah wrote those words. They predate the crucifixion by at least 700 years. And then there is Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian, not a Christian, not a sympathizer, not someone with any reason to confirm the claims of a minority religious movement. Writing around AD 116 in his annals, he refers to the founder of the Christians as a man called Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. The Roman Empire confirms the death. The empire that carried out the execution is its own witness. And every detail Isaiah wrote landed. The crown of thorns, the silence before Pilate, the soldiers dividing his garments and casting lots, exactly as Psalm 22 described, 1,000 years before either the psalm or the crucifixion. The legs of the men beside him broken to hasten death, and his left unbroken, as the Passover lamb and Apos' bones were never broken. The spear in his side, the burial in a rich man and Apos' tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, offering his own newly cut grave. 700 years of specific, verifiable promise. The pattern had not just held. It had become something beyond pattern. Now we go back to the old man on the black volcanic rock. His name is John. He is the last of the 12, the youngest, the one Jesus loved with particular tenderness, the one who stood at the cross when the others had fled. He has outlived every one of them. Peter, crucified upside down in Rome. James, beheaded by Herod. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, gone, in ways that history remembers with varying degrees of detail. John is exiled on an island called Patmos, a small island in the Aegean, volcanic, surrounded by water. The Roman Emperor Domitian has sent him there to silence him. It has not worked. Because on a Sunday morning, the Lord and Apos' day, as John calls it, he hears a voice behind him like a trumpet. And he turns, and he falls on his face. The vision that follows is the most extraordinary document in the New Testament. John sees the throne room of heaven. He sees the scroll sealed with 7 seals. He sees the rider on the white horse. He sees the armies of darkness undone. And at the end, at the very end, after the old order has passed away, after every broken thing has been accounted for, he hears the voice from the throne say 4 words. I am making everything new. The Greek word John uses is kainos. It does not mean renovated. It does not mean repaired. It does not mean the old thing cleaned up and returned to working order. Kainos means new in kind, new in nature, something that has never existed in the form it is about to take. This is the final promise. And here is what you have to see. What John, exiled and aged on that black rock, must have seen with a clarity that took his breath away. Every promise that came before was pointing here. The promise to Abraham, a nation, a seed, a blessing to all peoples, arrives here. The coat stripped, slave sold, prison forgotten Joseph. His story of pit to palace is a shadow of something larger, landing here. Moses and the people who burst out of Egypt after 400 years of silence. They were headed for a land. But there is a better land, and it arrives here. Ruth, the outsider woven into the family. She is a preview of every outsider who will one day be told, you belong here. The throne of David that was supposed to last forever. Here it is. Forever, finally, without the shadow of Babylon. Isaiah and Apos' suffering servant, pierced and silent and buried in a borrowed tomb. Risen, reigning, and arriving here. Every thread, every promise, every gap that looked like abandonment and turned out to be preparation. All of it pulled into 4 words from a throne that has no end. I am making everything new. 3 things to carry with you. The first, every promise in this video had a gap. Abraham waited 25 years. Joseph waited 13. Moses came after 400 years of silence. David and Apos' throne survived 600 years of apparent ruin. The gap is not evidence that God forgot. The gap has always been part of the pattern. Every single time. The second, you are not outside this pattern. You are inside it. The same God who tracked down a forgotten prisoner in an Egyptian cell, and a barren woman past the age of hope, and an exiled old man on a volcanic island. That God knows your name. You are not a footnote. You are not a bystander watching someone else and Apos' story. You are part of the longest chain of kept promises in the history of the world, and your chapter is not finished. The third, and this is the one to hold on to in the dark. The God who kept every promise in this video kept them for people in pits, people in prison, people in exile, people who said I went out full and came back empty, people who watched the temple burn and could not understand how forever could mean anything anymore. He kept his promises for people who had every reason to stop believing he would. He has not forgotten your name. If this video reached you at the right moment, you already know which promise you have been waiting on. You already know how long the gap has felt. And you already know how broken forever looks from where you are standing. The pattern says, hold on. It has never broken once. If this meant something to you today, subscribe. There are more of these coming. And if you are walking through a long gap right now, leave a comment below. You are not alone in it. Thank you for watching.